Recently on the internet there has been emerging more and more fear of certain household items. Maybe you are scared of the impact of this on your health, or you're getting very anxious when thinking about using this to store your food. This is why today we're going to be covering the topic of environmental toxins and hormonal health, and which chemicals should you be worried about, how big is their impact on your hormones, and what can you do to decrease the likelihood of them influencing your hormonal balance. Before I get into all of the chemicals, I need to clarify a few points about estrogen. All of the chemicals that I'm going to be discussing are chemicals that can have an influence on the estrogen receptors in both men and women, since both men and women have estrogen receptors in their body. These chemicals either have a similar chemical structure to estrogen, or through unknown ways they tend to influence the receptors. Estrogen receptors are also not a one-size-fits-all thing. We have ER alpha and ER beta. Those are the two different kinds of estrogen receptors that both men and women have. They are present in different amounts in different tissues. They also have not 100% of course binding affinity. Binding affinity is the likelihood that this hormone-disrupting chemical can bind to the receptor. It is not going to always bind to the respective receptor. The binding affinity is much lower than that for estrogen in most cases, but still these chemicals have been linked, most of them, to an increased likelihood of developing breast cancer. Another thing that the chemicals can do is prevent actual estrogen from binding to the receptors that it was meant to bind. After clearing up all of this, let's get into it. Firstly, we're going to cover the most popular one probably on the list, and that is bisphenol A. Bisphenol A was first introduced in the pharmaceutical industry in the 1930s as an estrogen. So that was its main activity, and I don't see why they had to include it then in household items, and they told that it's not going to have an impact on people's hormones. But I guess it's another case of let's do this and see what happens, and if it proves to be bad, then we're going to limit it, but whatever, I guess. Anyways, bisphenol A is present in a wide variety of items, including water bottles, also even baby bottles sometimes, depending on where you buy them from, also in children's toys and other items, food storage items, also containers, food cans. I refer to metal cans since bisphenol A is present in the coating between the metal and the food, since the metal cannot have direct contact in the food, and when metals leach into the food, this is also a toxicity hazard. Bisphenol A has been widely researched for its impact on hormones, and it has been found to bind to the estrogen receptors, mimic estrogen's activity. Bisphenol A has been also related not only to breast cancer, but also other disorders related to disruptions in estrogen. One of those is insulin resistance, since estrogen concentrations in one's body are connected to the amount of insulin produced and also to the glucose response. And studies have found that an increased exposure to bisphenol A can increase the likelihood of the development of diabetes in obese children. I say obese because generally fatty tissue is another thing that is connected to higher concentrations of estrogen. If you have more fatty tissue, then your body also produces more estrogen. One study also investigated the relationship between bisphenol A concentrations and the development of endometriosis. This is a condition, for those of you who do not know, where a tissue similar to your uterine lining develops outside the uterus and can lead to severe pain and also lower chances of getting pregnant. It is not exactly known why it happens, and you can only manage the symptoms of it, unfortunately. Apart from water bottles and plastic containers for food, bisphenol A has also been found in clothing that is made up of recycled materials. For everyone's good, bisphenol A has been partially regulated in the European Union and in the US, especially regarding items for children and babies. However, if you are looking to order some kind of baby toys or items from Shein or Temu, I would not recommend that, since this comes then from countries where that might not be as tightly regulated as it is in the European Union and in the US, and you should stick to buying from manufacturers that are based here in order to avoid a higher exposure to these chemicals. On the topic of food storage containers, one thing that you can do is switch to glass containers. I know they're much heavier, but again, you can heat them up without any problems, or switch only to microwave safe containers. The problem occurs mostly when the containers are being heated up, not as much as when you're storing cold food in them. I mean, if you want to prevent it 100% and also for a peace of mind, do not even use them for cold food. But you know, the main problem occurs when they are being heated up, because you know, if chemicals were just leaching into food so quickly and so effectively, the plastic would technically have to dissolve like into your food or something. It doesn't happen that fast or that effectively. It happens under certain conditions, and one of those conditions is microwaving the plastic container. Another chemicals that you have probably heard of are the so-called parabens and phthalates. Those are also present in a wide variety of household items, but not only. Also in cosmetic products, personal care products, makeup as well, also clothing items. Phthalates are also the ones present in scented candles, because this has been gaining a lot of popularity recently on TikTok and podcasts and everywhere. These chemicals can also be present in shampoos and conditioners, not only scented candles and makeup. However, if again you buy from manufacturers that are based in Europe or in the US, the probability of getting anything that contains those is not as big as if you buy from somewhere else. Here, the simplest thing that you could do is read your package label. It always says when these items are contained, and just look for anything with the ending of paraben or phthalate. It's really not that complicated to find out if something contains that chemical or not. I personally went through all of my shampoos and also other items that I have, hand creams, anything, and none of them contained one of those two chemicals. And I am not buying excessively expensive high-end shampoos and creams and anything. They just do not happen to contain those, which I am very glad for. Last year came out an article that explained that South Korea had done some investigation on the contents of phthalates and other harmful chemicals in items that were being sold from Shein and Temu, and they found that in some clothing items there were over 200 times the acceptable contents of phthalates. This is why, if you want to avoid any excessive exposure, you should not be purchasing from those retailers. And on the case of scented candles, just getting a candle that says that it is with soy wax, as far as I read, or just basically any natural wax, is going to eliminate the problem. To develop some kind of a hormonal disorder from these things that I'm explaining here would require you to consciously make all of the bad choices over time, all of the time. One article put it very well. It said, it is just another drop in the sea, but if it is not such of a effort for you, why do not eliminate this drop in the sea? Of course, lighting a scented candle or heating up your food in a plastic storage container 1 to 5 times is not going to directly lead to you developing some kind of a hormonal disorder, obviously. It is the same thing as with good choices. Having one healthy meal does not mean that you're going to automatically lose 10 kilos and heal all of your inflammation and solve all of your problems. It really comes down to the everyday choices that pile up and all of the drops in the sea that make up the end result. Therefore, I would not get overly anxious if I am somewhere visiting a friend and they have a candle lit and I don't know if the candle is from soy wax or is it a basic phthalate containing candle. You cannot control the environment around you all of the time. You can control the environment in your own home. It is that simple. You cannot always be in control of everything around you. And those a few times times where you did not manage to make the best choice that you wanted to make does not mean that you're going to have as large of a negative impact from that. The stress that you're going to suffer from, the worry from those times where you had to inhale some nice smells from a scented candle at your friend's home, the stress from that is going to cause you more harm than the scented candle itself. Now that I've got this out of the way, let's cover some chemicals that are present in the environment, but you cannot do much about their existence because they are not used for manufacturing today, but since they are the so-called persistent organic pollutants, they could still be accumulated in the soil or also in the air. They're just present around you. Some of them are the so-called dioxins, and they are mainly a production of combustion. They have been found to again have an estrogen mimicking activity. Technically, you would be exposed to those dioxins if you live in an area, for instance, where they are burning more waste, or if there were forest fires. They can also occur naturally. Therefore, this is not something that you can do much about if a forest fire happens, or if you live next to a place where they're burning a lot of waste. I'm not sure what the word for that is actually in English, but you might then consider getting at least an air purifier to minimize that. Other compounds on the list, now we're going over pesticides, are there already banned DDTs. DDTs were pesticides used around the Second World War to prevent from mosquitoes and other insects from damaging the crops and also spreading infectious diseases such as malaria, typhus, etc. However, it was pretty quickly, in a few decades, found out that these chemicals have a very negative impact on the fertility of animals. They also accumulate very well in the environment and mostly in the fatty tissue of the animals and of course the people that were exposed to them. One observation from the use of these chemicals was actually that the alligators in one lake in the US in the 1980s, the male population of those alligators had suffered a large amount of reproductive system issues such as the development of a micropenis, and the population generally of the alligators in that lake had very largely decreased. And once they banned using those pesticides, over time the population in the lake started growing again. Generally, they are banned in both US and Europe, but they are still being used for sure in some third world countries around the world as a cheaper alternative. Same goes for one other pesticide that is similar to this. It is the so-called DMDT, methoxychlor. It was developed as an alternative to DDT, but it was also quickly proven to have negative impacts on hormones and was also banned together with DDT. Polychlorinated bisphenols are other compounds that were fortunately already banned to use, but they still accumulate very well in the environment. They were previously used for cooling fluids, also for lubricants for electronics, but more in the manufacture field and in the field of electronics and not as much as food packaging, home materials, and etc. These chemicals again were found to lead to hormonal disruptions and were banned for use both in Europe and in the US. Since they are very persistent in the environment, one way to avoid exposure would be to just avoid the consumption of the skin of fish when you're eating fish, and also maybe do not over consume fatty fish. This is because, as I already mentioned, those chemicals are accumulating very well and especially similar to the DDT and DMDT in the fatty tissue of animals. There were also similar observations for these chemicals to the ones that were made in the lake in America. Here it was found out that the presence of these chemicals in the water led to an alteration of the ratio between the male and female populations of sea turtles. Moving on to chemicals that were partially banned, so some of them were banned for use in the US, in Europe, and also in Canada, and those are the so-called polybrominated flame retardants. As the name suggests, these chemicals are used to prevent things from catching fire. They are mostly used in household furniture, but also in electronics, again, just to prevent combustion. Therefore, these chemicals can accumulate in the household dust and be inhaled. This is the main form of exposure for these chemicals. A very short mention of two heavy metals that have been linked to hormonal disrupting activities. They obviously do not have the same structure as estrogen or a similar one, but through studies it was found that they can still have a negative influence on the hormonal health. Those metals are cadmium and arsenic. For cadmium, apart from smoking, since smokers have a lot of higher exposure to cadmium, other things that would lead to having a higher exposure would be excessive consumption of cereals, since it can be found in the soil. Generally also nuts, plant products, let's say. However, it is not as much again of a concern compared especially to the risk that smokers would have of inhaling more cadmium. Cadmium is one of the metals that can be found in cacao powder and also in chocolate, but these are quite tightly regulated, so I wouldn't be worrying that much about that. The case with arsenic is a bit different. Arsenic has been generally found to be very toxic for different reasons, but here in relation to the hormonal health, the case with arsenic and exposure is a bit different, since arsenic is one of the main contaminants in places where drinking water quality is low. Therefore, groundwater is the main reason why one would have a higher exposure to arsenic. There is also this popular belief that rice contains a lot of arsenic. Yes, it could contain arsenic, but the main risk here comes from contaminated groundwater. Also, what you can do about the rice: cooking rice in large amounts, the same way you cook pasta, could reduce the arsenic content in rice up to 60%. Rinsing the rice, I thought this could help, but actually it has been found to not really decrease the arsenic content, so I guess I don't have to do that anymore. Apart from those, fish and shellfish are other things that could contain higher concentrations of arsenic. Phytoestrogens, those are the plant-derived compounds that can mimic the activity of estrogens, were not covered in this video because I have a separate video on those, and if you're interested you might check them out. Anyways, I hope that I have cleared up now a little bit the topic about, hormone disrupting chemicals. If you're privileged enough to live in a European country or in the US, and if you do not regularly order Shine and Temu items, and you do not use them for every single thing in your day-to-day life, your exposure to these chemicals is probably negligible. Technically, you can do something about 3 chemicals on this list, and for the rest you really can't do much because you can't do anything about their presence in the environment. You're not the one that manufactures the groundwater, and you're also not the one that grows these food items. You can't really control any of that, but still it is good to have some knowledge about all of this, I believe. And it is also good to know that we have come quite a long way, and it actually used to be a lot worse in terms of chemicals that were influencing our hormonal health, as you saw with the pesticides and also the other things that are banned already. If you enjoyed the contents of this video, do not forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Leave down in the comments below if you would like me to do a video on a specific topic of your interest, and I will be seeing you in the next video.